1868 to 1869, the Boshin War, a crucial civil conflict in Japan that concluded the Tokugawa Shogunate and reinstated the imperial authority under Emperor Meiji, thereby commencing the significant Meiji Restoration. Provoked by pervasive discontent among samurai and regional daimyo regarding the shogunate's failure to maintain internal conflict and the mounting influence of new Western powers, the war epitomized a critical confrontation between conservative elements loyal to Tokugawa and the progressive groups who championed modernization, centralization, and the dismantling of the outdated feudal system. Significant confrontations, including the Battle of Toba-Fushimi and the Siege of Edo, show the strategic advantage and innovative methodologies of the imperial allies, bolstered by assistance from foreign advisors and the integration of contemporary military technologies. The rapid triumph of the pro-imperial factions enabled significant political, social, and economic reforms, among them a centralized government, the advancement of industrialization, and the modernization of Japan's infrastructure and military. Thus, the Boshin War not only solidified imperial authority, but it propelled Japan towards becoming a significant global power, fundamentally transforming its societal framework and international position. Okay, introduction out of the way. You know why we're here. The Boshin War. Little Japanese history today. Don't often hear about this war, but you're hearing about it today, so better late than never. Now, as always, best way to support is like, comment, subscribe, tell a few of your friends, all that good stuff. You know what to do if you feel like doing it. But for now, let's all get nice and relaxed, and we can begin our full history of the Boshin War. Now we must mention, to set the scene, with the notable exceptions of Korea via Tsushima, Qing dynasty China, that being the ruling monarchy in China at that time till about 1912, via the Ryukyu Islands, and the Dutch via the trading post at Dejima. Japan had maintained a strict isolationist policy for an entire 2 centuries before 1854, and this limited all contact with foreign powers. A kingdom in hiding, completely isolated. Through the implied threat of force, however, the expedition led by U.S. Navy Commodore Matthew C. Perry in 1854 opened Japan to international trade, and that had the other consequence of sparking the rapid growth of westernization and international trade. Things changed very quickly, and so the Tokugawa Shogunate soon faced internal dissension, which grew into a radical movement known as the Sonno Joi, meaning revere the emperor, expel the barbarians, largely because of the degrading terms of the unequal treaties, as agreements like those negotiated by Matthew Perry are called. At least that's what the Japanese call them. You won't find them called that in the Western vernacular sources. And so we have Emperor Meiji, who concurred with these views, and in contrast to centuries of imperial custom, started to actively participate in state affairs. He vigorously opposed the treaties and made an effort to sway the shogunal succession when the chance presented itself. In March 1863, his order to expel the barbarians marked the culmination of his efforts. The order sparked attacks against the shogunate and foreigners in Japan, even though the shogunate had no intention of enforcing it. The most well-known of these was the death of the English trader Charles Lennox Richardson, wrong place at the wrong time, for which the Tokugawa Shogunate was forced to pay 100,000 British pounds in compensation. Shelling of foreign warships in the port of Shimonoseki was another part of the attacks, and as equally well received. Armed retaliations by foreign powers, such as the multinational Shimonoseki campaign and the British bombardment of Kagoshima, successfully countered these actions in 1864. Simultaneously, the Hamaguri rebellion was launched by the forces of Choshu domain, and the Ronin, those masterless samurai, in an attempt to take control of Kyoto, the location of the emperor's court and traditional capital. However, the shogunate forces led by the future shogun Tokugawa Yoshinobu put an end to the rebellion. The shogunate also ordered the first Choshu expedition, a punitive expedition launched against Choshu, and managed to subdue them without even engaging in combat. The initial opposition from the imperial court and Choshu leadership at this point had begun to wane, but the Tokugawa were unable to regain complete control of the nation over the course of the following year, as the majority of the daimyos, those regional rulers, started to disregard directives and inquiries from the Tokugawa seat of power in Edo, that is the old word for Tokyo. Since 1865, the shogun had looked to France for weapons and training support. In an attempt to increase French influence and turn Japan into a dependent client state, Léon Rocher, the French consul in Japan, backed the shogunal military reform initiatives. As a result, the British sent a military expedition to their own to rival the French. The Satsuma domain had grown closer to the British and was working with them to modernize its army and navy, in spite of that very unwelcome bombardment at Kagoshima. One Scottish merchant, Thomas Blake Glover, supplied the southern domains with large quantities of guns and warships. Its military endeavor may have involved direct participation from American and British military experts, who were typically former officers. In an effort to counter the French influence with the shogunate and establish a legitimate, unified imperial rule in Japan, British Ambassador Harry Smith Parkes backed the anti-shogunate forces. Southern Japanese leaders like Satsuma Saigo Takamori or Choshu's Ito Hirobumi and Inoue Kaoru developed close relationships with British diplomats, particularly Ernest Mason Satow, during that time. After the shogunate itself, the Satsuma domain became the second largest buyer of Western ships, almost all of which were British built, and they received British assistance for their naval modernization. After the war, Satsuma samurai dominated the imperial navy, which often turned to the British for even more support. To prepare for future wars, the shogunate also updated its own military. According to Parkes' plan, the British, who had been the shogunate's main foreign ally, were originally hesitant to help, because Napoleon III had gained military prestige at the time from his victories in the Crimean War and Second Italian War of Independence. The Tokugawa began to rely primarily on French expertise. After all, they knew what they were doing. Now, the shogunate made significant progress in building a strong and modern military. A navy consisting of 8 steam warships was already the strongest in Asia after years of construction, all with the most modern technology. In 1865, the French engineer Léonce Vernet constructed Japan's first modern naval arsenal in Yokosuka. The US was then ordered to purchase the French-built ironclad warship CSS Stonewall, which had been constructed actually for the Confederate States Navy during the American Civil War, and a French military mission arrived in January of 1867 to restructure the shogunate and establish the Denshutai elite force. As far as the US, they refused to release the ship because Western powers had officially declared their neutrality. But after the neutrality was lifted, the imperial faction acquired the ship and used it in battles in Hakodate under the name Kotetsu, which literally means iron-clad. The shogunate declared its intention to lead a second Choshu expedition and punish those rebellious domains after a coup d'etat with Choshu brought the extremist factions back to power. Consequently, Choshu formed a covert alliance with Satsuma. The shogunate suffered a significant loss of power when Choshu overthrew it in the summer of 1866. However, Tokugawa Yoshinobu and Emperor Meiji succeeded Tokugawa Iemochi and Emperor Komei, who both passed away in late 1866. Now, according to historian Marius Jansen, all of these circumstances put together effectively made the prospect of a truce inevitable. Satsuma and Choshu secretly issued an order on November 9, 1867, directing the slaughtering of the various subject Yoshinobu in the name of the Emperor Meiji. But just before this, Yoshinobu resigned his position and power to the emperor, and he agreed to be the instrument for carrying out imperial orders at the suggestion of the daimyo of the Tosa domain. As a result, the Tokugawa Shogunate was effectively over. Yoshinobu's apparatus of state persisted even though his resignation had left a void in the highest echelons of the government. Furthermore, the shogunate government, and the Tokugawa family in particular, retained many executive powers and continued to be a significant force in the changing political order. According to Sato, Yoshinobu had consented to a gathering of daimyos in the hopes that a body like that would heal him. Possibly the hard-liners from Satsuma and Choshu could not tolerate. These factors culminated on January 3, 1868, when they took control of the imperial palace in Kyoto. The day after, Emperor Meiji, who was at this point only 15 years old. I know, right? What were you doing when you were 15 years old? Announced his full return to power. Saigo Takamori intimidated the Imperial Consultative Assembly into removing the title shogun and ordering the seizure of Yoshinobu's lands, and this was despite the fact that the majority of the assembly, which represented all domains, was pleased with the formal declaration of direct rule by the imperial court and tended to support a continued collaboration with the Tokugawa. This was under the concept of just government, kogiseitai in Japanese. Yoshinobu first consented to these demands. However, on January 17, 1868, he called for the Restoration Proclamation to be repealed and stated that he would no longer be bound by it. He made the decision to plan an attack on Kyoto, which was under the control of forces from Satsuma and Choshu on January 24th. His discovery of a string of arsons in Edo, beginning with the destruction of the exterior of Edo Castle, the principal Tokugawa residence, led him to make this choice. Satsuma Ronin, who attacked a government office that day, was held accountable for this. The following day, shogunate forces retaliated, and they retaliated hard by attacking the Edo home of Satsuma's daimyo, where numerous shogunate opponents had been hiding out and causing trouble under Saigo's leadership. Numerous opponents were killed, others were captured and later put to death, and they even went so far as to burn the entire house down. That ought to make a statement. Armstrong guns, Minié rifles, and a single Gatling gun were used to completely modernize the forces of Choshu and Satsuma. Although a core elite force had recently been trained by the French military mission, the shogunate forces had been lagging somewhat in terms of equipment. In order to create an army that included both modern and antiquated components, the shogun also depended on troops provided by allied domains, which were not always as sophisticated in terms of military hardware and tactics. Traditional styles, like the Tanegashima matchlock, coexisted with a variety of imported smooth-bore rifles and muskets from nations as diverse as Germany, the Netherlands, United States, France, and Britain, pretty much anywhere where they could get them. In fact, about 200,000 smooth-bore muskets, which had been imported or made in the country since about 1600, were used by the majority of the shogunate soldiers. About 1840, pro-Western reformist Takashima Shuhan imported the first modern firearms from the Netherlands. However, the shogun's ally, the daimyo of Nagaoka domain, had several thousand modern rifles and 2 Gatling guns. In 1866, the shogunate is known to have ordered 30,000 contemporary Drace needle guns. Yoshinobu outfitted his personal guard with 2,000 of the most advanced chess-pot rifles that Napoleon III had actually given him personally. However, the shogunate is also known to have used the very old and outdated Tanegashima matchlocks. Not very effective, but it's better than nothing. Now onto those Minié rifles, which were also muzzle-loading and only allowed for 2 shots per minute. They were the primary weapon of the imperial troops. Now 2 shots a minute doesn't sound like very much, but when you are firing in line formation, and you have maybe 3 ranks, it's not too bad, if everybody can be trained well enough to reload them and all fire in proper volleys. I'm not sure if you've seen the movie Zulu, but in the last battle of that, there's this beautiful depiction of volley fires from those kind of 2 shots a minute rifles. A little bit more modern, but, Well, either way, these Minié rifles were far more accurate, far more deadly, and had a far greater range than those smooth-bore muskets. At the Battle of Ueno, in July 1868, Choshu troops are known to have employed improved breech-loading mechanisms, like the Snyder mechanism, which developed at a rate of roughly 10 shots per minute against the shogunate's Shogutai regiment, and going from 2 shots a minute to 10 shots a minute. Well, that certainly makes a difference. It is known that American-made Spencer repeating rifles were also used by Tosa troops in the Northeast Theater during the second half of the war. And then we have American-made handguns like the Smith & Wesson Army No. 2 from 1863, which Glover brought to Japan and was used by Satsuma forces. They were reportedly very popular, a practical weapon, and one that you could rely on. Modern Armstrong guns with explosive shells coexisted with wooden cannons, which could only fire 3 or 4 shots before exploding. Not too useful. Throughout the war, Satsuma and Saga troops effectively employed Armstrong guns. In fact, as early as 1575, Japan was producing its own cannons, which were used by both the shogunate and the imperial side. In terms of warships, older steamboats and even traditional sailboats coexisted with some of the newest ironclads, like the kotetsu we mentioned. In fact, at first, the shogunate had the advantage in warships and the foresight to purchase the kotetsu. But after the war begun, foreign powers refused to deliver the ship on the grounds of neutrality. It was finally given to the imperial faction soon before the Battle of Toba-Fushimi. Now, graduates of 2 samurai academies founded the Sanpei Tai in 1862 as part of a larger modernization effort. As part of their feudal duties to supply troops to the shogun, the daimyo were able to raise a standing army from the shogun's personal lands. The Sanpei Tai, or Shinei Jobugun, was an army of 13,500 plus men, including over 1,400 officers and over 1,000 cavalry, about 8,300 infantry, 2,000 of them with rifles, almost 5,000 artillery crew, 48 8-pound field guns, and 52 16-pound siege guns. And that's pretty good. It's definitely got everything you need for pretty much every situation. You just hope that their logistics are going to work as well as they hope. Now, half kashi, that being poorer samurai, and half seishi, richer samurai, were to be contained by the force. Men between the ages of 17 and 45 were to be recruited for 5-year service terms in battalions of 600, companies of 120, and platoons of 40. The shogunate desperately needed both rice to feed the soldiers and firearms, so the daimyo were permitted to replace labor with money. The plan, however, was immediately derailed when the shogun encountered opposition to supplying men and funds for the purchase of firearms. Paradoxically, the Satsuma domain supplied the most men under this new system, with 4,800 infantry, 100 cavalry, 8 guns, and 100 other men. The shogun permitted commoners to be recruited too in 1863, but by 1867 the force had only grown to about 5,900. The shogun then raised 5 battalions to supplement this force. At least 1,500 men were added to the army when the shogun disbanded the city and legation guard units and incorporated them into the Sanpei Tai. In 1867, the shogunate employed 17 French officers in an effort to modernize its military. The elite Denshu Tai were formed by the 900 men and trained by these 17 officers. 12 pieces of artillery and 3,000 jaspot rifles were bought by the French officers. In addition to adding carbine and lance cavalry to the force, 3 distinct military schools were built for the infantry, artillery, and cavalry, with very little engineer training. The 900 Denshu Tai men were supposed to be divided up among the numerous shogunate armies in order to reorganize and train them, but the start of hostilities prevented this from happening. With 25,000 samurai in 1840, the Satsuma domain experienced a faster rate of modernization than the shogunate because it was more open to the outside world. A foundry for the manufacture of firearms was established in 1854, and 3 ammunition plants and an artillery foundry soon followed. Because of the poor military performance of its forces, Satsuma officials were further motivated to implement more extensive military reforms after the Anglo-Satsuma War in 1863. As a result, the daimyo started enlisting peasants in the military and hired a number of French officers to lead them. In 1840, there were 11,000 samurai in the Choshu domain, which was also more reform-friendly and ambitious than Satsuma in terms of reform and peasant recruitment. The 300-strong Kihetai, a mixed group of samurai, townsmen, and peasants, was commanded by Ronin officers wearing Western uniforms and exhibiting strict discipline. Its strength increased to 900 men with the raising of a second and third company. The use of gunboat diplomacy attracted a large number of volunteers, and by 1865 a total of 60 units had been formed, with an additional 980 men joining various shotai, or auxiliary militias. By 1868, these shotai auxiliary militias had been incorporated into the Choshu military and equipped with contemporary weapons. When the war broke out, the core of the pro-imperial army was made up of 14,400 men from 36 infantry battalions, which were added to the regular domain army after 150 shotai were regularized in 1868. 1/6 of the 60 drafts were to be sent from Kyoto to form an imperial army, and the remaining 50 were to garrison the daimyo's domain. In April of 1868, Emperor Meiji himself ordered the dispatch of 60 men per 10,000 koku. That was 150 kilograms of rice, the amount needed for a man per year, produced in his domain. And so we get to the Battle of Toba-Fushimi, which we've mentioned a few times, which took place near Toba and Fushimi at the southern entrance to Kyoto on January 27, 1868. Shogunate forces attacked the forces of Choshu and Satsuma. French military advisors had already trained some of the 15,000-strong shogunate forces. The renowned Shinsen-gumi were among their numbers during this battle, and despite being outnumbered 3-1, the Choshu and Satsuma forces were completely equipped with Minye rifles, Armstrong howitzers, and a few Gatling guns, and that ought to even the playing field a little bit. Following an inconclusive beginning, the defending troops were presented with an imperial banner on the second day, and this is going to be a hard name, Ninna Jinomiya Yoshiaki. Well, excuse me for pausing to compose myself. A relative of the emperor was appointed as the nominal commander-in-chief, officially transforming the forces into an imperial army, in Japanese known as kangun. Furthermore, a number of local daimyos who had previously supported the shogun began to switch to the imperial court after being persuaded by courtiers. These tipped the military scales in favor of the imperial side, including the daimyos of Yodo and Tsu in February. Following the defections, Yoshinobu fled Osaka to the battleship Kayomaru and withdrew back to Edo, reportedly upset by the imperial endorsement of Satsuma and Choshu's actions. One can hardly blame him. Of course he's going to be upset by that. Although it is frequently believed that the shogunate forces should have won the battle, the imperial victory resulted from the shogunate's forces' retreat after being demoralized by his flight and treachery of Yoda and Tsu. The battle was soon over when Osaka Castle was taken on March the 1st. The naval battle of Awa, which took place in Awa Bay near Osaka, the very day after the Battle of Toba-Fushimi began, pitted the shogunate against elements of the Satsuma navy. This was the second encounter between the two contemporary navies in Japan. Despite its small scale, the shogunate also prevailed in this battle. But the shogunate was still regarded as Japan's only legitimate government, according to a declaration made by foreign ministers who met in the open harbor of Hyogo, that is, modern-day Kobe, in early February. This gave Tokugawa Yoshinobu hope that other countries, in particular France, would consider intervening on his behalf. The shogunate was abolished. Harbors would be opened in compliance with international treaties, and foreigners would be protected, according to an imperial delegation that visited the ministers a few days later. In the end, the ministers ultimately agreed to acknowledge the new administration. However, in the months that followed, a number of attacks on foreigners were a result of the rise of anti-foreign sentiment. In the Sakai incident on March the 8th, 1868, Tosa samurai killed 11 French sailors from the corvette Dupleix. A group of samurai attacked the British ambassador himself, Sir Harry Parkes, in Kyoto, right in the streets 15 days later. A plan to halt the imperial court's advance at Odawara, the final strategic entry point to Edo, was developed starting in February with the assistance of the French ambassador, Léon Roche. However, Yoshinobu rejected the plan. In fact, Léon Roche was so shocked by this that he immediately handed in his resignation. I think he was looking for an excuse, to be honest. Well, influenced by British Minister Harry Parkes, foreign countries signed a strict neutrality agreement in early March, which prohibited them from interfering or arming either side, at least until the conflict was resolved. After winning the Battle of Koshu Katsunuma, Saigo Takamori led the imperial forces that triumphed in the north and east of Japan. After the surrender was negotiated by the shogun's army minister, Katsukaishu, he finally surrounded Edo in May of 1868, resulting in its unconditional defeat. After this surrender, some groups persisted in their resistance, but on July 4th, 1868, they were finally defeated at the Battle of Ueno. At the same time, Enomoto Takeaki, the shogun's navy commander, refused to give up all of his ships. In an attempt to launch a counterattack alongside the northern daimyos, he sent only 4 ships, that includes the Fujiyama, that fled north with 2,000 men and the remaining shogun's navy, which included 8 steam warships. A few French military advisors, most notably Jules Brunet, who had formally resigned from the French army to join the rebels, were with him. Following his surrender, Yoshinobu lost all of his titles, land, and authority, and was put under house arrest. When he showed no more interest or ambition in national affairs, he was later freed. Although the majority of Japan acquiesced to the emperor's authority, the resistance was maintained by a core group of northern domains that backed the Aizu clan. The alliance of northern domains, which was mainly made up of 50,000 troops from the domains of Sendai, Yonezawa, Aizu, Shunai, and Nagaoka, was formed in May by a number of northern daimyos to combat imperial troops. The alliance included the majority of the northern domains in addition to these core domains. Although the daimyo of Nagaoka caused significant losses to the imperial forces during the Battle of Hokuetsu in May of 1868, the castle finally collapsed on May 19th. The position in Sendai became untenable as imperial troops advanced northwards and defeated the Shinsengumi at the Battle of Banari Pass. paving the way for their October 1868 attack on the castle of Aizu Wakamatsu in the Battle of Aizu. On August 26th, Enomoto's fleet arrived at Sendai Harbor. Despite its size, the Northern Coalition was ill-prepared and used conventional warfare techniques. Due to a lack of modern weapons, last-minute attempts were made to construct wooden cannons, reinforced with roping that fired stone projectiles. When mounted atop defensive structures, these cannons could only fire 4 or 5 projectiles before exploding. However, the German arms dealer Henry Schnell was able to provide the daimyo of Nagaoka with 2,000 more modern French rifles and 2 of the 3 Gatling guns in Japan. Either way, after the coalition broke up, the fleet departed Sendai for Hokkaido, on October the 12th, 1868, with 2 additional ships and roughly 1,000 additional soldiers. And then we have the guerrilla corps, the Yugekitai, led by Hitomi Katsusaro, the remaining shogunate troops under Otori Keisuke, and several more French advisors who came with them, being Fortant, Garde, Marlin, and Bouffier. The Meiji period began when Edo was renamed to Tokyo on October 26th. Beginning that month, the White Tiger Corps, Byakutai, young warriors committed a mass ritual life-taking as a result of the siege of Aizu. On November 6th, after fighting for a long month, Aizu finally conceded. After losing on Honshu, Enomoto Takeaki fled to Hokkaido with his few French advisors and the remaining navy. In order to create an autonomous island nation devoted to Hokkaido's development, they banded together to form a government. Japan's only republic, the Republic of Ezo, was formally founded and based on the American model. Of course, they had an election too, and Enomoto was elected president with a landslide. The Republic made an effort to connect with foreign delegations in Hakodate, including the Americans, French, and of course the Russians, but they were unsuccessful in gaining any support or recognition from the other countries. The Imperial Governing Council rejected Enomoto's offer to give the Tokugawa shogun the territory under imperial control. With the new fortress of Goryokaku at its center, they consolidated their defenses around the southern peninsula of Hakodate during the winter. The French captain, Jules Brunet, seconded the commander-in-chief, Otori Keisuke, and the troops were divided among 4 brigades under a Franco-Japanese command. A French non-commissioned officer commanded each of these, which were further split up into 8 half-brigades, each of which was commanded by a Japanese commander. When the Imperial Navy arrived at Miyako's harbor on March the 20th, the Ezo rebels prepared a bold plan to take control of the Kotetsu in anticipation of the Imperial ship's arrival, and thus in the Battle of Miyako Bay, 3 warships were sent for a surprise attack under the command of Shinsengumi commander Hijikata Toshizo. But due to poor weather, engine problems, and the Imperial troops' decisive use of the Gatling gun against samurai boarding parties, the Tokugawa side lost the battle. The Battle of Hakodate began in April of 1869, when Imperial forces sent a fleet of 7,000 infantry to Ezo after quickly solidifying their control over mainland Japan. The fortress of Goryokaku was surrounded after the Imperial forces advanced quickly and prevailed in the naval engagement at Hakodate Bay. which was the first significant naval conflict between modern navies in Japan. After realizing that things have gotten out of hand, the French advisors fled to the Côte Legon, a French ship based in Hakodate Bay and commanded by able Nicolas Bergas du Petit Thouars. Now that's harder than the Japanese names. Well, from there, they were taken back to Yokohama and eventually to France. The Japanese asked for the French advisors to be judged in France, but the former French advisors were not punished, mainly because the French public was in support of their behavior, and punishing them would have run counter to public expectations. Enomoto was initially asked to surrender, but he declined and sent the naval codes he had returned home from Holland to Kuroda Kiyotaka, the imperial troops general, in order to keep them safe. The Ezo Republic ended when Enomoto submitted on the 27th of June 1869, finally accepting the rule of Emperor Meiji. Otori Keisuke persuaded him to do so by saying that choosing to live through defeat is a truly brave course of action, stating, "Dying is easy. You can do that any time." I don't know about that one. Seems kind of contrary to the whole samurai thing. But times were changing, of course. Well, approximately 8,200 of the 120,000 men who were mobilized during the conflict were killed, and over 5,000 of them were injured, which is surprising. I thought there would have been more people killed. Well, after winning, the new administration moved forward with the uniting of the nation under the imperial court's unified, legitimate, and potent rule. At the end of 1868, Edo was renamed Tokyo, and the emperor's residence was essentially moved from Kyoto. The domain's political and military authority was gradually eroded, and in 1871 they were effectively reorganized as prefectures, with the emperor appointing their governors. Anointing. The effective expropriation and abolition of the samurai class was a significant reform that drove many of them into poverty, while enabling many to transition into administrative or business roles. And many of them did. They already had the connections, so they all just started companies or swapped out those samurai robes for a Western suit. It makes me wonder how many of those families now in Japan have the old samurai roots. I'm sure there's quite a few of them. Well, for several decades after the war, the southern domains of Satsuma, Choshu, and Tosa held the majority of important positions in the government. This was known as the Meiji oligarchy, and was formalized with the establishment of the Genro. Then there was the Yasukuni Shrine, which was constructed in Tokyo in 1869 as a memorial to the Boshin War victims. And, well, I can't really just skip past the Yasukuni Shrine, can't I? It's a little bit of a controversial place. Do you have any idea why? Well, the Second World War, of course. The Japanese were doing some very distasteful things, to say the absolute least. We don't learn as much about it as we should. We're always learning about Germany, always learning about those terrible things that were done, sure. But on the other side of the world, there was an equally horrible thing going on. Things beyond imagination. A lot of these, quote, war heroes, unquote, who participated in these kinds of atrocities, their names are written in the Yasukuni Shrine. and kind of put up as martyrs for the cause. Yes, a lot of people are not happy with this, particularly the Chinese, and particularly since there's been no real acknowledgement of the war crimes from the Japanese. But that's modern history. We don't really do much of that on this channel. Now, back to where I was, and with a short apology for going off on a bit of a tangent there. Now, although they barely avoided execution, some of the former shogun's top partisans were imprisoned. Saiko Takamori and Iwakura Tomomi's insistence led to this clemency, even though Parks, the British envoy, was heavily cited in this decision. That severity towards Keiki Yoshinobu or his supporters, especially in the way of personal punishment, would injure the reputation of the new government in the opinion of the European powers, he said. And he had urged Saito, as Ernest Sato once put it in this manner. Most of them were called to serve in the new government, after serving 2 or 3 years in prison, and some went on to have very successful careers, shaking off the old ways. For example, Enomoto Takeaki would go on to become the Minister of Education and an envoy to China and Russia. Not a bad position. Under the motto, Fukoku Kyohei, rich country, strong army, the imperial side abandoned its goal of driving foreign interests out of Japan in favor of a more progressive approach that aimed to continue modernizing the nation and renegotiate unfair treaties with foreign powers. And so early in the Civil War, attitudes towards foreigners began to change. On April 8, 1868, new signboards that explicitly condemned violence against foreigners were put up in Kyoto, and later across the whole nation. Emperor Meiji personally received European envoys during the war, initially in Kyoto and then in Osaka and Tokyo. Emperor Meiji's reception of Alfred, the Duke of Edinburgh, in Tokyo as his equal was also unprecedented. Although relations between the imperial court and foreign powers improved during the early Meiji period, the initial French support for the shogun caused a brief deterioration in relations with France. But of course, soon after, in 1874 and 84, respectively, a second and third military expedition was actually invited to Japan. Under the leadership of the naval engineer Louis-Émile Bertin, France assisted in the construction of the Imperial Japanese Navy's first sizable modern fleet in 1886, marking the high return of levels of interaction. During the final years of the shogunate, the nation began to modernize, and the Meiji administration eventually followed suit. Of course, the Meiji Restoration requires a video of its own. Perhaps next time. And here we are, arriving again, as we always do at the end of the video. Hard to start the video without arriving at the end of it, isn't it? That would only be logical. Now I'd like to thank my patrons and supporters on YouTube, on both platforms, as Dark Carey, Kimberly, Ember, Ben, Britt, Charles, Aaron, James, Jeffrey, Melissa, Scott, Stark Factory, Wendy, Jaden, Sherry, Jessica, Christine, Sally, Katiana, Christine, Fazabo, Legitmus, Maverick, Susan, Dr. Neuro Nerd, Cameron, Alexander, Nicholas, Daniel, JR, Charlene, and Christopher. Thank you so much, and I will see you in the next exciting episode. Good night, everyone. Lots of love to you all.